Let's talk about oil painting. I freaking love me some oil painting. Now, don't get me wrong, acrylics are great too, but they're not as rich. They're not as buttery, as creamy, as luscious as oil paints. So, if you don't know the difference between acrylics and oils, let me tell you. Acrylics are water-based paints, and as such, they dry very quickly. So if you are in a dry climate like here in Colorado, they might dry within, I don't know, maybe 5 minutes of applying them, maybe less in the summertime, or if there's a lot of, a breeze going by. And that's great if you like to work really quickly and in layers. But if you like to blend paint, like I do, oils is the way to go. So, like I said, acrylics are water-based, they dry quickly, they are less expensive, they clean up much more easily than oil paints. Those are the benefits. And of course, drying quickly might not be a benefit. So oil paints stay open longer. And what I mean by that is they stay wet and workable longer. And for me, the way I like to paint, that is a benefit. I don't like my paints to dry very quickly. In fact, often when I paint with acrylics, I will use a retarder, which is just something you mix in with your acrylic paints to keep them open longer. So oil paints are, just as I say, they're oil-based. They are, generally speaking, more expensive. And they are wonderful. But regarding the expense, you end up using less oil paint. I go through acrylics much more quickly than I do oil paints. So oil paints are, generally speaking, they are thicker, although you can buy heavy body acrylics that are fairly thick. I find oil paints to be more opaque, although there are translucent oil paints. There's so much to know about this stuff. Honestly, though, I find oil paints easier to work with when it all boils down. And my students who have started with acrylics and moved on to oils, generally speaking, ultimately find the oils easier to work with also. Sometimes it takes them a little bit to warm up to them because it is a different way of approaching things. You can't sit down to the canvas and paint with oils in the same way that you paint with acrylics. However, you can put down a layer of acrylic paint, and once it's dry, you can go over it with oils. And I love to paint that way because I can get something down very quickly in acrylics and then work it really deeply with oils. And even though you can't layer oils quickly, you can still layer them. It might take several days for the oil paint to dry, though. It might take a week for the oil paint to dry, or longer if you paint really thickly. But if you do thin layers, sometimes it'll just take a couple of days. And I always say have a few paintings going at once, because if you don't feel like stopping what you're doing, but you've gone as far as you can go, like if I wanted to add some, let's say orange on top of the blue paint here, and the blue paint was still wet, it would turn muddy because those colors are opposite on the color wheel. So they're very dynamic next to each other, but they don't blend so well together. They don't play well together. They make a neutral color when you mix them. So I would have to wait for this painting to dry before I put the orange on top of the blue. Whereas with acrylics, just wait a few minutes, it dries, and then you can go in with the orange. So it all depends on how you like to do it. But if I were ready to use some orange paint and my blue were still wet, I might just pull out another canvas and start painting with some orange paint. And that would satisfy that craving. So I'm a fan of slow art, even though very often my classes are fast. We do fast art. But I'm a fan of working slowly and just slowing down and fully getting into the moment and into your work. And this video you're watching right now is sped up like 400 times. So you can tell how, you can imagine how slowly I'm actually painting. But when you paint slowly, you have time to reflect as you do it. You have time to think about what you're doing. And think about whatever else is running through your mind and whatever your mind is working on as you're painting. Our minds are working on things in the background, solving problems. And painting lets you zoom in just enough to something to let your mind go and let it be free to work on those problems while you're painting. But I digress. Oil paint. The other way that oils are different from acrylics is that they don't clean up with water. So you can actually get water-soluble oil paints. I have no idea what that means. Since oil and water don't mix, doesn't make sense. But they do have oil paints that you can clean up with water. I have tried them and I didn't like them. So maybe I'm just a purist. I don't know. But I do use solvents with to clean up my brushes. And in that jar that I just put the brush in there, I'm using some odorless paint thinner. So here's where oil paints can be a little iffy, right? Because they can be a little bit harmful. You have to, use these solvents in a ventilated area. And you don't want to get oil paint all over your hands. And since it doesn't dry quickly, if you accidentally set your brush down and don't see that it got paint on your table, for instance, and then later, 2 days later, you can put your hand in that paint and it will still be wet. And then you might transfer it to someplace else. And the next day you can come in and put your hand on that place and spread the paint around. So you have to be very mindful. And I think that's also what I love about oils, is that you do have to be mindful about what you're doing. It's very, very focused. I get very focused when I'm painting with oils. And by the way, I paint very instinctively. So this painting that you're seeing, I don't have a grand plan for it. I don't visualize too much anyway what I'm going to paint before I paint it. I just see what is going to happen on the canvas. And I experiment and I work with do things that I think might look good or feel like the right thing to do. Sometimes they work, sometimes they don't. And here's what's great about oil paint is I can still move that paint around. At this point in the video, I don't know how long I've been painting, maybe an hour. But all of the paint that I put down is still wet. So I can still blend color into the first brush stroke that I put down. And I love that. So if you want to play with oil paints, if you want to learn how to paint with oils, my suggestion is to start painting with someone who knows what they're doing already. You know, acrylics, you can just sort of pick them up and start playing. But people often get very frustrated when they try and do that with oil paints. And also there's some things like these chemicals we're using, these paint thinners. I've had people come into my studio who tell me they've been pouring their paint thinner down the drain, and you can't do that. So if you're working with someone who knows what they're doing, they will tell you that. And there are other less harmful solvents you can use. I have heard. I have not experimented with them. I will once I run out of my 10 tons of odorless paint thinner that I have. But I might have a lifetime supply, so we'll see. So I guess the question then is, the logical question is, what do you do with your paint thinner if you don't throw it away? And the answer is you keep using it. You just keep using it. And the pigment all settles to the bottom of the jar or whatever you're using after a few days. And you can pour off the clear paint thinner into another container. And I have a can of nothing but old dirty paint thinner. And I've had it for years. Like, it never seems to get filled up, because once that settles down, then you can still pour off the clear paint thinner. And, you know, the pigment remains behind because it's heavier than the paint thinner. It's kind of cool, actually. All right, that's all I got for you. If you have questions about oil painting or acrylic painting or whatever, let me know. Leave them in the comments. I am happy to answer questions. Or you can join me online for some virtual painting sessions, private lessons, group classes. My schedule is at denverartclass.com. Or you can join my virtual art community at paintthroughit.com.